If your best friend calls you at 3 in the morning and only says, "Come outside," you don't ask questions. You just go. That was the only thought running through my half-awake brain as my phone screen glowed 3:02 a.m. across the dark bedroom. Nolan never called that late. In 11 years of friendship, he had texted at impossible hours, sent photos of broken bridges he was inspecting before sunrise, even shared terrible jokes when he knew I couldn't sleep, but he never called. I answered before the second ring. There was nothing except the soft hiss of rain and his uneven breathing. Then his voice, quieter than I had ever heard it. "Can you come outside?" No explanation. No panic. No apology. Just those 4 words. "Nolan." I sat upright, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. "Are you okay?" A pause stretched long enough for me to hear distant thunder. "Please." The line stayed open. That single word hit harder than if he had shouted for help. Nolan Whitaker was the kind of guy who fixed problems before anyone realized they existed. He reinforced aging buildings, solved impossible calculations, and somehow remembered everyone's birthday without needing a calendar. Asking for help simply wasn't something he did. I shoved my feet into sneakers without bothering to tie them, grabbed the first hoodie hanging by the door, and hurried downstairs. The hallway smelled faintly of old paint and someone's burnt popcorn from earlier that night. Outside, cold rain slapped against my face the moment I pushed through the front entrance. Streetlights blurred behind sheets of water, turning the parking lot into a sea of shimmering gold reflections. My old pickup sat where I had left it, but my eyes found Nolan before anything else. He stood near the curb beneath the maple tree that had already lost most of its leaves, even though it was only early October. He wasn't holding an umbrella. His dark jacket clung to his shoulders, soaked through, while rain dripped steadily from his hair. He wasn't looking at my apartment building. He wasn't looking at his phone. He was staring straight ahead like he had forgotten where he was. "Nolan," I called, jogging toward him. He turned slowly, and something inside my chest tightened. It wasn't fear I saw on his face. Fear usually comes with urgency. This looked emptier than that, like someone had quietly taken the ground out from under him. "What happened?" I asked as I reached him. He blinked once, almost surprised I was really there. Water streamed down his forehead, but he made no effort to wipe it away. "You're going to catch pneumonia," I muttered automatically, tugging open the passenger door of my truck. "Get inside." He obeyed without arguing. That alone felt wrong. Nolan always argued about something, even if it was only the fastest route across town. The heater groaned to life, filling the cab with stale warmth as rain hammered against the windshield. I glanced sideways while fastening my seatbelt. His hands rested quietly in his lap, trembling just enough for me to notice. "Where do you want to go?" I asked. He stared through the fogging window, his reflection barely visible against the darkness outside. After several long seconds, he finally spoke. I didn't know where else to go. The windshield wipers swept back and forth with stubborn determination, but the rain kept winning. It blurred every traffic light into soft streaks of red and amber, while the heater slowly chased the chill from the cab. Nolan stayed silent beside me, his damp jacket leaving a dark patch on the passenger seat. Normally, he would complain that I still had not fixed the squeak in the dashboard or tease me about the faded coffee stains on the center console. Tonight, he simply stared out the window, watching the city drift by as though he had never seen it before. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. "You want coffee?" I asked. He shrugged. "Sure." That was not an answer Nolan usually gave. He always had an opinion about coffee. Too bitter. Too expensive. Too hot. Too cold. Tonight he accepted whatever the world handed him, and somehow that unsettled me more than anything else. I pulled into the only 24-hour diner still open on the east side. The glowing neon sign buzzed softly above the empty parking lot. Rain tapped against the roof as we hurried inside. The place smelled like fresh pancakes, black coffee, and the lemon cleaner every diner in America seemed to buy from the same supplier. An older waitress looked up with a warm smile that belonged to someone who had worked the night shift for decades. "Rough weather," she said. "You boys can sit wherever you like." Nolan managed the faintest nod. We slipped into a booth near the window. Steam curled from 2 mugs a few minutes later, but neither of us reached for them. I waited because that was what friendship sometimes required. Not answers, just patience. Finally, Nolan wrapped both hands around the warm ceramic mug without taking a sip. "Do you remember sophomore year?" he asked quietly. "The camping trip?" I laughed under my breath. The one where you insisted you could build a fire without matches. One corner of his mouth almost smiled. You still remind me about that. Because we ate cold beans for dinner. The smile disappeared as quickly as it came. He looked down into the coffee as though the surface held something only he could see. I thought my life would look different by now. I frowned. Different how? His fingers tightened around the mug. Organized. Predictable. Stable. You have all of those things. That is what I thought too. His voice cracked so slightly that I almost wondered if I imagined it. Until today. I leaned forward. What happened? Another long silence settled between us. The waitress refilled my coffee without interrupting. Outside, headlights splashed through puddles before disappearing into the darkness. Nolan drew a slow breath. I was supposed to mail our wedding invitations tomorrow morning. My chest tightened. I knew he and Lauren had been engaged for almost 8 months. I had helped him carry furniture into their townhouse. I had listened while he debated honeymoon destinations. Everything had seemed normal. Was there a fight? I asked carefully. He shook his head. No, then what? He closed his eyes for a moment before opening them again. They looked exhausted, not from lack of sleep, but from carrying something far too heavy for far too long. When I picked up the invitations tonight, he whispered, I looked at my name beside hers. He swallowed hard. And the only person I wanted to tell was you. For a moment, I honestly thought I had misheard him. The sounds around us faded into the background. The waitress carried plates to another table. A country song drifted quietly from an old speaker near the kitchen. Rain continued tracing slow rivers down the window beside our booth. None of it felt real anymore. I looked across the table at the man who had been my closest friend since we were both awkward freshmen trying to survive orientation week, and I searched his face for the punchline that never came. What do you mean? I asked carefully. Nolan exhaled through his nose and finally took a sip of his coffee, although it was obvious he could not taste it. Lauren looked at me tonight and asked if I was nervous. His fingers rested against the mug as if the warmth was the only thing keeping him grounded. I told her every groom gets nervous before a wedding. He laughed once, but there was no humor in it. She smiled and said that was not what she meant. She asked if I was having second thoughts. I stayed quiet. He continued before I could interrupt. I wanted to tell her no. I wanted to be the man she deserved. His eyes drifted toward the rain outside. Instead, I froze. I remembered Lauren well. She was thoughtful, patient, and kind. She loved Nolan with a certainty that had always impressed me. Watching them together had never made me jealous. It had simply convinced me that my best friend had found the future he wanted. What happened after that? I asked. Nolan rubbed both hands across his face. She asked me a question I could not answer. Another pause settled between us. She asked who I called first whenever something wonderful happened. I smiled faintly without thinking. That has always been me. The words escaped before I realized what they meant. Nolan nodded slowly. She knew that. My smile disappeared. She asked who I wanted beside me whenever life fell apart. I looked down at my untouched coffee. Still me. Yes. His voice barely rose above a whisper. Then she asked why the happiest moments of my life and the hardest moments of my life always seemed to point back to the same person. My heartbeat became strangely loud inside my own ears. Nolan swallowed before continuing. I could not answer because she already knew the truth before I did. He looked directly at me for the first time since we had entered the diner. His eyes were tired, red from the rain and the sleepless night, but completely honest. She told me that she had spent months trying to become the person I looked for the way I looked for you. I felt my throat tighten. Nolan, he gently shook his head. She did nothing wrong, Caleb. She did not yell. She did not blame me. She simply said she deserved to marry someone whose heart arrived before the invitations did. He released a slow breath that seemed to carry the weight of an entire year. So I told her the wedding could not happen. I stared at him, unable to form a single complete thought. The silence between us no longer felt empty. It felt like standing on the edge of a bridge neither of us had realized we were building all these years, suddenly seeing the other side for the very first time. Neither of us spoke while we walked back to the truck. The rain had softened into a light drizzle that clung to the pavement like a thin sheet of glass, reflecting every streetlight in long ribbons of gold. I started the engine, but instead of pulling toward my apartment, I turned east without thinking. Nolan noticed after a few blocks. Where are we going? He asked quietly. You will know when we get there. He did not question it. 20 minutes later, the city disappeared behind us, replaced by empty roads lined with towering pines that swayed gently in the early morning wind. The clouds were beginning to break apart, revealing faint patches of stars above the dark horizon. I parked beside the old lake where we had spent countless weekends during college whenever exams became too much or life refused to make sense. The wooden dock looked older now, its weathered boards silver beneath the moonlight, but it still stretched into the calm water exactly the way I remembered. We climbed out without saying a word. The air smelled of wet earth, pine needles, and fresh rain. Somewhere across the lake an owl called once before silence settled over everything again. Nolan slipped his hands into his jacket pockets while we stood side by side at the edge of the dock. I forgot this place existed, he admitted. No, I replied softly. You just forgot you needed it. He let out a quiet breath that almost sounded like a laugh. Do you remember the first time we came here? You insisted you could skip a rock farther than anyone else. I could. You threw it straight into the water. He smiled, a real one this time, brief but unmistakable. You still make that sound worse than it was. Because you blamed the lake. His shoulders relaxed for the first time all night. We stood there watching tiny ripples drift across the water until he spoke again. Do you know what scared me the most tonight? I shook my head. It was not ending the engagement. His eyes stayed fixed on the lake. It was realizing that after everything happened, after Lauren quietly packed a bag and walked out the front door, my first instinct was still to call you. He looked down at the damp wooden planks beneath his feet. I almost did not. Why? Because I thought maybe this was unfair to you. I frowned. You have never been unfair to me. Maybe I have. His voice was barely louder than the breeze crossing the water. Maybe I have been asking you to carry pieces of my life for years without noticing how much space I was taking in yours. I wanted to answer immediately, but the words refused to come. Instead, I watched the first hint of dawn begin painting the eastern sky with pale shades of blue and lavender. I suddenly remembered dozens of little moments that had seemed ordinary at the time. Nolan bringing soup to my apartment when I caught the flu. Driving 4 hours just to attend my first photography exhibit. Sitting beside me for an entire afternoon after my father passed away without trying to fill the silence with empty advice. He had always been there. So completely that I had stopped noticing the shape his presence left in my everyday life. You know what I remember? I finally said. Every time something important happened to me, before I even looked at my phone, I already knew there would be a message from you. Nolan lowered his head. I never wanted you to face anything alone. The words settled between us with unexpected weight. Neither of us moved. The lake remained perfectly still, reflecting the brightening sky like polished glass. While somewhere deep inside me, memories I had always called friendship quietly began asking to be understood by a different name. By the time we drove back into the city, the morning rush had already begun. Commuters hurried across crosswalks with paper cups balanced in one hand and phones in the other, completely unaware that my entire understanding of the last 11 years had shifted before sunrise. Nolan insisted he was all right. I did not believe him. But I also knew there were moments when the greatest kindness you could offer someone was the freedom to breathe on their own. I dropped him off at his townhouse just after 8. He thanked me with the same quiet sincerity he had always carried, then disappeared behind the front door. I sat in my truck for another minute before driving home, too exhausted to think, and somehow too awake to sleep. Around noon, my doorbell rang. I expected a package or maybe my neighbor asking to borrow a ladder again. Instead, Lauren stood on my porch holding a small cardboard box against her chest. She looked tired, but not angry. Her eyes carried the calm sadness of someone who had already cried enough to leave only acceptance behind. I hope I am not interrupting, she said gently. Not at all. I stepped aside. Come in. She looked around my apartment with quiet curiosity before setting the box on the kitchen counter. Inside were a few framed photographs, an old baseball cap, and a faded college sweatshirt that belonged to Nolan. He left these at my place over the years, she explained. I thought he might want them eventually. We stood in an awkward silence until she glanced toward one of my landscape photographs hanging above the sofa. He always said this was his favorite picture you ever took. I smiled faintly. He says that about all of them. No, she shook her head. Only that one. Her answer surprised me. She folded her hands together and looked directly at me. Can I ask you something? Of course. She hesitated, choosing her words with remarkable care. Has Nolan ever looked at you while you were talking and completely forgotten that anyone else was in the room? I blinked. I never paid attention. I did. Her voice remained soft, without bitterness or blame. At dinner parties, birthdays, holidays. It happened all the time. I searched for an explanation, but none came. Lauren offered a small, understanding smile. You know what finally made me realize I could not marry him? I slowly shook my head. It was never because he treated me badly. He was thoughtful, loyal, patient. I could have asked for no better partner. She paused before continuing. But every time something made him genuinely happy, his eyes searched for you before they searched for anyone else. The room suddenly felt much quieter. She walked toward the window, overlooking the street below. I spent months wondering what I lacked. Then she looked back at me with remarkable grace. Eventually, I understood it was never about me. My throat tightened. Lauren, I am so sorry. Please do not be. She smiled again, this time with genuine warmth. Love is not something you can negotiate into existence. She picked up her empty coffee mug and carried it to the sink before turning back toward the door. Just promise me one thing. Anything. Do not waste another 10 years pretending neither of you sees what has been there all along. She left with the same quiet dignity she had brought into the apartment, and after the door closed, I found myself standing alone in the middle of the living room, replaying hundreds of forgotten memories that suddenly looked completely different when viewed through someone else's eyes. Lauren's words refused to leave me alone. They followed me through the apartment as I unpacked my camera bag, watered the neglected fern by the window, and stood staring into the refrigerator without remembering why I had opened it in the first place. By late afternoon, I convinced myself I needed a distraction. I climbed onto the step stool in the hallway closet to organize old storage boxes that had not been touched since my last move. Dust floated through narrow beams of sunlight cutting across the room, making everything feel suspended in time. One worn cardboard box slipped from the top shelf and landed with a soft thud at my feet. Across the lid, written in thick black marker, were 2 words in Nolan's handwriting. College stuff. I smiled without thinking. Years ago, we had packed everything together after graduation, promising we would sort it out later. Apparently later had taken almost a decade. I knelt on the floor and lifted the lid. Inside were faded ticket stubs from baseball games, receipts from late-night diners, postcards from road trips we barely planned, and a cracked coffee mug that somehow survived 3 different apartments. Beneath them rested an old digital camera wrapped carefully inside a gray sweatshirt. I recognized it immediately. It was the first camera I ever owned, the one I believed had stopped working during our senior year. I thought I lost you, I murmured to myself. Curiosity replaced exhaustion. I found the charging cable buried beneath a stack of notebooks and waited while the tiny battery icon slowly came back to life. When the screen finally flickered on, I laughed quietly at the terrible date stamp still blinking 12 years behind. There were thousands of photographs stored on the memory card. I expected landscapes, campus buildings, and blurry attempts at wildlife photography before I knew what I was doing. Instead, the first image filled the screen. It was me. I was sitting on the library steps holding 3 textbooks and laughing at something outside the frame. I frowned. I did not remember that picture. I pressed the next button. Another photograph. Me carrying groceries across the parking lot. Another. Me asleep during a road trip with my head against the passenger window. Another. Me adjusting my camera beside a hiking trail while morning sunlight filtered through the trees. My heartbeat slowed into something almost unreal. I kept scrolling. Winter. Summer. Graduation. Thanksgiving. Random Tuesday afternoons. Birthday barbecues. Charity races. Every season of nearly 11 years unfolded one photograph at a time, and somehow I was standing at the center of almost every frame. Not posing. Not looking at the camera. Simply living. There were pictures of me concentrating, laughing, reading, cooking, talking with strangers, feeding ducks by the lake, and staring out at sunsets I no longer remembered seeing. Whoever had taken them had never interrupted the moment. They had simply watched with quiet affection, preserving pieces of my life I never knew anyone had noticed. Then I reached the final image. It showed the old lake at sunrise. I stood at the end of the dock holding my camera toward the water while the first light painted the sky in soft shades of orange and blue. At the bottom of the photograph, tucked into the corner where I almost missed it, was a tiny handwritten caption that had been added before the file was saved. It read, He never sees himself the way I do. I stared at those 7 words until the screen dimmed. Somewhere between the silence of my apartment and the fading afternoon light, I realized those photographs had never been about documenting places. They had been about remembering one person, and for the first time in my life, I understood that the one behind the camera had been quietly telling me a story I had never learned how to read. The photograph stayed on my coffee table long after the camera battery died. Evening slipped quietly through the apartment, replacing golden sunlight with the soft glow of street lamps outside my window, but I never turned on the television or reached for my phone. Instead, I kept replaying moments I had dismissed as ordinary for years. Nolan insisting on taking the group picture and somehow always handing the camera to someone else before anyone noticed. Nolan volunteering to drive so I could watch the scenery instead of the road. Nolan quietly asking me to stand in better light whenever I talked about photography, pretending he was only curious about camera settings. Every memory returned carrying a detail I had somehow missed the first time. I finally picked up my keys just after sunset. I did not call ahead. I simply drove across town, guided more by instinct than thought. Nolan answered the door wearing an old gray sweatshirt and jeans, looking like he had not slept since the night before. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then his eyes dropped to the camera in my hands. The color slowly drained from his face. "Where did you find that?" he asked. "In a box we packed after college." He closed his eyes briefly and leaned against the doorframe. "I forgot it was there." "I do not think you forgot." My voice stayed calm, but my heart refused to do the same. "I think you hoped I never would." He stepped aside without saying another word, silently inviting me in. His townhouse felt strangely unfamiliar without wedding magazines scattered across the coffee table or color samples pinned to the refrigerator. Half-packed boxes lined one wall of the living room, as though an entire future had been paused in the middle of being built. We sat across from each other, separated by a coffee table that suddenly felt much wider than it was. I placed the camera between us. I looked through the pictures. Nolan stared at it without reaching forward. All of them. Every single one. A faint smile appeared, touched with embarrassment more than happiness. Then there is nothing left to hide. The room fell quiet again. Outside, someone walked a dog along the sidewalk, and laughter drifted faintly from a nearby apartment. Ordinary life continued as though nothing extraordinary was happening inside these 4 walls. Nolan rubbed his hands together before speaking. "Do you know how many times I almost told you?" I slowly shook my head. "Too many to count." He laughed softly, though it carried more sadness than amusement. "After graduation, during your first gallery opening, the night your truck broke down outside Denver, and we spent 6 hours waiting for a tow truck. When your father passed away, every birthday, every Christmas, every time you hugged me goodbye." He looked directly at me, and there was no hesitation left in his expression. I always convinced myself there would be a better moment. His smile faded. Then I realized there never would be, because I was terrified. Terrified of what? I asked quietly. Losing the one person who has always felt like home. His answer settled over the room with gentle certainty. "If I told you how I felt and you did not feel the same, I knew I could survive the embarrassment." He took a slow breath. "What I could not survive was losing my best friend." I looked at the camera resting between us, then back at the man who had spent more than a decade quietly protecting a friendship he believed was worth more than his own happiness. In that moment, I understood the greatest secret he had been carrying was never that he loved me. It was that every single day, he had chosen silence because he believed keeping me in his life mattered more than ever asking me to change it. 3 nights passed before I found the courage to do anything with everything Nolan had told me. We exchanged only a handful of messages during those days. Simple ones. "Did you eat? Drive safe. Good night." They looked exactly like the conversations we had shared for years, yet every word carried a new weight neither of us knew how to acknowledge. On the 4th night, the weather shifted again. Heavy clouds rolled across the city, and by 10 o'clock rain drummed steadily against my apartment windows. I stood there watching the streets disappear beneath shimmering reflections until an unexpected thought settled quietly into my mind. For nights earlier, Nolan had stood outside this same building alone, soaked by the rain because he had not known where else to go. This time I reached for my phone first. My fingers hovered above the screen before I finally pressed his name. He answered almost immediately. "Caleb." I smiled despite myself. Can you come outside? Silence. Then a confused laugh. Now. Yes. Are you all right? I looked through the rain streaking down the glass. Just come outside. I ended the call before I could lose my nerve. 5 minutes later, I was standing beside the curb in front of my apartment. I left my umbrella upstairs on purpose. Rain settled across my shoulders and dampened my hair, but I barely noticed. The cool air smelled like fresh asphalt and wet leaves, exactly as it had a few nights before. A familiar pickup truck turned onto my street, its headlights sweeping across the buildings before slowing to a stop. Nolan climbed out, looking around until his eyes found me standing beneath the same maple tree where he had stood before. He hurried toward me. Caleb, what is going on? I watched him stop a few feet away. Water ran from the edge of his jacket, while concern filled every expression on his face. You forgot your umbrella too, he said automatically. I laughed softly. Maybe I wanted to understand what you felt that night. His shoulders slowly relaxed. Rain continued falling between us, gentle enough now that the city seemed wrapped inside a quiet curtain. I took one careful step forward. You told me you were afraid of losing your best friend. Nolan lowered his eyes. I still am. Then listen to me. He looked back up. You have spent 11 years protecting something you thought was fragile. I swallowed, suddenly aware of how loudly my own heart was beating. I spent those same 11 years believing I already understood what you meant to me. I shook my head with a quiet smile. I was wrong. His expression softened, but he remained completely still, as though afraid even hope might disappear if he moved too quickly. Lauren asked me not to waste another 10 years pretending. I continued. The photographs reminded me that someone had been seeing me with kindness long before I ever learned to see myself that way. I stepped close enough that the rain no longer felt cold. You never had to stand out here alone that night. My voice barely rose above the sound of falling rain. And you never will again. Nolan closed his eyes for just a second before opening them with a look I had never seen directed at me so openly. It was not surprise. It was relief, quiet and overwhelming, like someone finally setting down a weight they had carried for far too many years. Neither of us rushed the moment. We simply stood together beneath the rain, no longer separated by silence, knowing that sometimes the longest journey is only the distance between two people who have been walking beside each other all along. The rain finally eased into a fine mist as we walked toward my apartment building, neither of us rushing to reach the front door. For the first time in years, the silence between us no longer felt like something waiting to be filled. It felt complete. Inside, I handed Nolan a dry towel from the hallway closet, the same closet where an old cardboard box had quietly changed both of our lives only a few days earlier. He laughed when he noticed I still had the ancient coffee mug from college sitting on the kitchen counter. You never threw it away, he said. Neither did you, I replied, thinking about the camera that had survived every move because neither of us had truly wanted to leave the past behind. We made coffee even though it was almost midnight. Outside, rainwater continued sliding down the windows in slow silver lines while the apartment filled with the familiar smell of fresh coffee beans. It felt strangely ordinary, and perhaps that was what made the moment so extraordinary. Nothing around us had changed except the truth we finally allowed ourselves to speak. Nolan leaned against the counter, turning the warm mug between his hands. I keep thinking I owe everyone an apology, he admitted. Lauren deserved honesty much sooner. You deserved honesty too. I shook my head gently. We cannot change the years behind us. He looked up. No, but we get to decide what we do with tomorrow. His expression softened into the same quiet smile I had seen thousands of times before, only now I understood where it had always come from. We carried our mugs to the living room and sat near the window overlooking the street. Cars passed below with their headlights reflecting across the wet pavement, while somewhere in the distance a train whistle echoed through the sleeping city. I realized we were not talking about extraordinary dreams or dramatic promises. We talked about simple things. Taking another trip to the lake before winter arrived. Visiting the small bookstore we both loved the following weekend. Helping Nolan pack away the unopened wedding decorations so he would not have to face them alone. Planning a photography hike once the autumn colors reached the state park. They sounded like ordinary conversations, yet every plan quietly included the same unspoken assumption. We would face the future together. After a long while, Nolan stood and walked toward the front door. Old habits almost made me say, drive safely. Text me when you get home. Instead, I smiled. You know you do not have to leave tonight if you do not want to. He paused, searching my face to make certain he had heard me correctly. Are you sure? I have never been more certain about anything. Relief crossed his face so naturally that it felt less like a beginning than a homecoming. He set his keys on the small table beside the door before walking back into the living room. The apartment suddenly felt warmer, brighter, and somehow larger than it had ever been. Outside, the clouds slowly drifted apart, revealing a handful of stars above the quiet city. 11 years earlier, we had become best friends without realizing we were beginning the most important relationship of our lives. It simply took us 11 years, one rainy night, and the courage to stop hiding behind the word friendship before we finally understood that the place we had both been searching for was never a destination at all. It had always been the person waiting on the other side of a single phone call, willing to answer no matter what time the clock said.